The boy looked at the judge with wide eyes, his mind racing with disbelief. He had heard the words, but they didn't quite seem real, not yet. He had spent so long trying to stay invisible, trying to protect himself from the hurt and rejection that he had grown accustomed to, but now here was this woman in front of him, making promises that seemed too good to be true, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to believe them. He glanced at his mother beside him and saw the same uncertainty in her eyes, but there was something else too, a glimmer of hope that hadn't been there before. She had always been the one to hold things together for both of them, but now it felt like she was seeing the possibility of a future she had once thought impossible. The judge took a step closer to them, her voice calm but firm. I know this hasn't been easy for you. I know that you faced things that no child should ever have to face. But I'm telling you now that things can be different. She paused, and her eyes softened. You have the right to a future. You have the right to a life where you are seen, heard, and given the tools to succeed. The boy's heart pounded in his chest as the words sunk in. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that this time it would be different. But the fear was still there deep down in his gut, telling him that things would never change, that promises were just that, words that meant nothing. He turned to his mother, again searching her face for answers, but she only squeezed his hand tighter, reassuring him with her touch. He could feel her uncertainty too, but there was a quiet strength in her now, a belief that maybe this could be the moment that changed everything. He took a deep breath and looked back at the judge, who was still watching him patiently, as if she was waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to say something, anything, but all he could do was nod his head slowly. He didn't have the words to express what he was feeling. He didn't know if he even knew what he was feeling yet, but the simple act of nodding felt like a small step forward. It was a small step toward trust, a small step toward believing that maybe he wasn't as alone as he had always thought. Maybe there were people out there who saw him as more than just a label, more than just a statistic. She smiled at him and nodded back. You don't have to say anything right now, she said softly. I know that this is a lot to take in, but I want you to know that I'm here for you, and I will do everything I can to make sure you have the support you need moving forward. It was the first time in a long time that the boy had heard someone speak to him with such sincerity. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, not with such care, not with such certainty. The judge's words felt like a weight lifting off his shoulders. Even though he knew there was still a long road ahead, he felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone anymore. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he could have a future. After all, he looked at his mother one last time and saw the tears in her eyes. They weren't tears of sadness, but tears of relief and gratitude. For the first time in a long time, she believed in the possibility of a better future for her son, and with that belief came a strength that they both needed to face whatever came next. The boy stood up slowly and nodded again to the judge. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely above a whisper, but the judge heard him loud and clear, and she smiled again, a genuine smile that made him believe that this time it was different. This time things could change. The boy and his mother stepped out into the hallway where the bright fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows against the walls. They were silent at first, both unsure of what to say. After the events that had unfolded in the courtroom, the boy's heart still raced in his chest. His thoughts jumbled like a storm inside his mind. He couldn't remember a time when he had felt so many emotions at once: fear, excitement, confusion, hope, all crashing together. He looked up at his mother and saw the same mix of emotions on her face. Her eyes were wide with a quiet disbelief, but there was also something else, something stronger, something that made him realize how much she had carried all these years on her own. His mother had fought for him alone for so long, and now it felt like they had someone on their side. For the first time, the boy could see it in her eyes that she believed things could change too, that they could actually have a future where he wasn't just a name on a paper or a statistic in a report, but a person with real possibilities. The hallway felt cold compared to the warmth that had filled the courtroom, but the boy couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to happen, something that would change everything for them. The sound of footsteps behind them broke their silence, and they turned to see one of the court officers approaching. He was a tall man in a uniform with a serious expression. but when he spoke his voice was kind. He told them that the judge had requested they meet with her briefly before leaving the courthouse. The boy's stomach dropped at the thought of having to go back into the courtroom. He wasn't sure if he could handle more questions or more speeches, but his mother reassured him with a gentle nod. They followed the officer down the hallway to the judge's chambers. With each step, the boy's nerves grew more intense, his palms sweaty as his thoughts raced. He had no idea what to expect next, but the words the judge had spoken still echoed in his mind. She had promised to help him, she had promised that he wouldn't be forgotten, and now he couldn't help but wonder if she truly meant it, or if this was just another empty gesture to make him feel better. He wanted to believe her, but fear had always been his companion, and it wasn't going to be so easily pushed aside. They reached the door of the judge's chambers, and the officer knocked softly before entering the room. The boy stepped inside hesitantly and looked around at the small office. It was nothing like the cold, impersonal courtroom. Everything here felt more comfortable, more real. He could see stacks of papers on a desk and bookshelves filled with law books, but there was a sense of warmth in the space that made him feel like he wasn't just another case waiting to be solved. The judge was sitting behind her desk when they entered, and she stood up to greet them. Her smile was warm and genuine, and the boy felt a sense of relief wash over him. She motioned for them to sit, and when they did, she looked at the boy and said, "I wanted to speak with you one more time before you leave. I want you to know that I'm not giving up on you, and I'm going to make sure that the help you need will be there for you every step of the way." The boy could barely believe what he was hearing. Her words felt like a lifeline that he had been desperately searching for so long. She wasn't just offering empty promises, she was offering action. She was offering a real chance to change things for him, and he didn't know how to process it, how to accept it, but it felt like something he had never had before. Hope. The boy felt like his whole world had shifted in a single moment, as if the ground beneath him had cracked open, and he was standing on the edge of something unknown, but possibly good. He looked up at the judge once again, her face still calm, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made him feel something he had never felt before. He wasn't sure how to process it, how to understand this feeling that was starting to swell in his chest, but he couldn't deny it. For the first time in his life, he felt like someone truly cared for him, like he wasn't just a problem to be fixed or a child to be ignored, but a person whose feelings and experiences mattered. The courtroom seemed different now. The people in the room no longer felt like strangers. They no longer looked at him with pity or judgment. They looked at him as if they were waiting for him to say something, anything, but the boy couldn't speak. The lump in his throat had returned. He couldn't find the words to express what was happening inside him. He was overwhelmed by the possibility of a future where he was seen and heard, a future where his voice could actually make a difference. His mother looked at him and saw the change in him. Her son had been through so much in his young life, and she had fought so hard to protect him from a world that seemed to always be against him. But now she saw something in his eyes that she had longed to see: hope, real hope. The kind of hope that made her believe things could be different for him, that maybe the road ahead wouldn't be as hard as she had feared. But she also knew that this moment was only the beginning. The judge had given them a glimpse of something better, but she had also set the stage for a long fight ahead. The system wasn't going to change overnight, and neither would the perceptions of people who had been taught to see children like her son as a burden or a statistic. The boy's journey wasn't going to be easy, but for the first time she believed that it could be worth it. The boy's heart raced as the judge continued to speak, but he wasn't listening to her words anymore. He was too lost in the emotions that had overwhelmed him. His mind was spinning with thoughts he couldn't make sense of, but the one thing that kept coming back to him was the judge's promise that he wouldn't be forgotten, that he would have the chance to succeed, that he could have a future where his voice mattered. And that was a thought he had never dared to believe before. He had always been told that he wasn't enough, that he wasn't worth anyone's time, but now he had been given a chance, a real chance, and he couldn't quite wrap his mind around it yet. The judge stood up from the bench and nodded to the court. She called for a brief recess so that everyone could gather their thoughts before the next steps were taken. The boy and his mother stood up together and began to walk out of the courtroom. They didn't say anything at first. Neither one of them knew what to say, but as they reached the door, the boy looked up at her with wide eyes and whispered, "Do you think it's really going to happen?" She looked down at him and smiled softly. "I don't know, baby, but I think we're finally on the right path." The boy sat down slowly, his hands still trembling as the weight of the judge's words sank in. He could feel the eyes of the entire courtroom on him, but this time it wasn't the usual harsh judgment. It wasn't the looks that made him feel small or invisible. It was something different, something that made his heart beat just a little faster in his chest. It felt like the world was finally giving him a chance, but with that came the fear of what would happen next. Would the judge's words truly make a difference, or would they be forgotten as so many promises had been before? His mother squeezed his hand gently beside him, her fingers wrapped around his like a lifeline, and he leaned into the warmth of her touch, feeling for the first time that maybe they weren't alone in this battle. Maybe someone was finally fighting for them, fighting for him. The judge continued to speak, but her words were now directed at the lawyers in the room. She told them that she would be requesting a full evaluation of the boy's situation, that a child welfare expert would be brought in to assess his needs to ensure that he was receiving the proper care and support. She spoke of the importance of addressing the underlying causes of why this boy was even here in the first place, the systemic issues that had led to him feeling abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect him. It wasn't just about this case anymore, it was about the future. It was about making sure that children like him didn't fall through the cracks, that they didn't get lost in a system that too often turned its back on the most vulnerable. The boy couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been so accustomed to the idea that no one cared about him that this moment felt like a dream, something too good to be real. But the reality of the situation was sinking in slowly, and with it came the dawning realization that things could be different, they could be better, but it would take more than just the judge's words. It would take action, real change, and the boy could only hope that this time it wouldn't be another empty promise. His mother looked at him with tears in her eyes. She had spent years fighting for her son's future, and for the first time in a long time she felt like she wasn't fighting alone. The boy turned his head to look at her, and for a moment they shared a look that spoke volumes, a silent promise between them that no matter what happened they would face it together. The judge looked at the boy one last time before turning her attention back to the rest of the court, her voice firm yet kind as she spoke of the importance of ensuring the boy's education was not disrupted, that he would be given the tools and resources he needed to thrive. She emphasized that this was not just a matter of law, but a matter of humanity, and that the boy deserved every opportunity to succeed no matter the circumstances that had led him to this point. She made it clear that she would be closely involved in the process from here on out, and that she would not allow this boy to slip through the cracks, not as long as she had a voice in the matter. The boy's heart swelled with something he had never felt before, hope. But it was fragile, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to trust it yet. He had been let down too many times to believe in promises so easily, but the judge's words lingered in the air, and for the first time in his life, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could finally have a chance. The room was still as the judge's words hung in the air. The boy stood there unsure of what was happening, but for the first time he felt a small spark of hope flicker within him. The heaviness in his chest began to lift just a little bit as the judge turned her attention back to the proceedings. The tension in the courtroom was different now. It wasn't the same cold silence that had filled the room at the beginning. It was softer, more human, like everyone in the room was trying to process the shift that had just occurred. The judge's voice cut through the stillness once again as she addressed the lawyers in the room. She told them that the case would not continue as planned, that she was going to take a different approach to ensure that the boy's future was not decided by a set of rules that had failed him from the start. It was a surprising move, one that no one had anticipated, and yet everyone seemed to understand the weight of what she was doing. The boy's heart raced as he listened to her words. He had never heard anyone speak like this in a courtroom. It wasn't about about the law, it wasn't about the case, it was about him. For the first time in his life, he felt like someone was actually looking out for him, not as a criminal, not as a problem, but as a child with a future that deserved to be protected. The judge continued to speak with authority, but her tone was gentle. It was as though she were speaking directly to the boy. Even though she was addressing the room, she acknowledged the flaws in the system that had led to this moment and how they had contributed to the boy feeling like his voice didn't matter. She told the court that no child should ever be made to feel that way, and that she would not stand by and allow it to happen. The boy's mother sat beside him, watching in awe as the judge continued to challenge the system she had spent years trying to navigate in hopes of securing a better future for her son. She had never seen anyone speak like this with such conviction for the boy. It was as though the judge had opened a door to a world that felt so far out of reach, a world where children like him could have a chance to be seen for who they really were, not for the mistakes they had made or the labels others had placed on them. The judge turned her gaze back to the boy, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no judgment in her eyes, only a quiet understanding and something deeper, a shared recognition that this was a turning point, not just for him, but for all the children who had been lost in the system before him. Her next words were soft but powerful. "I promise you," she said, "that I will do everything in my power to make sure that you are given a chance to succeed, that this moment will not define your future." The boy swallowed hard, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had never heard anyone say something like that to him. It was more than just hope, it was a promise, one that he wasn't sure he could believe. But something deep inside him wanted to trust her. His mother looked at him, her face filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. The weight of years of struggle seemed to shift just a little bit as she too began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. The boy stood there in a daze as the judge's words echoed in his mind. Her voice was steady, but it felt like a distant hum in his ears. He had never imagined hearing something like that from anyone, especially not from someone who had so much power over his fate. For the first time he felt like the walls around him were beginning to crack, like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to shrink in fear anymore. The judge's eyes remained fixed on him, her expression soft yet determined, and the boy felt something stirring inside of him, a feeling he couldn't name, but it made him stand up a little straighter, as if the weight he had been carrying for so long had suddenly lightened. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew something had shifted in that room, something fundamental, and his heart began to beat with a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. He had never felt so seen, so understood, and yet so afraid all at once. His mind raced with questions. What did this mean for him? Would this truly change anything, or was it just a momentary kindness that would fade away like so many others? The boy's mother sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. She too was trying to process the judge's words for her son. She had seen the hardship he had faced, the unfairness, the cruelty, and yet she had never expected a moment like this to unfold in the courtroom. She felt the hope rising inside of her as well, but the fear was still there, lingering in the background. She wanted to believe that things were changing, but how many times had she been disappointed before? The judge looked at the room full of people and then back at the boy with a calm authority in her eyes. She said to the rest of the court, "This boy has a voice, and it will be heard no matter the circumstance. I will not allow him to be lost in this system. We are here to ensure that he is given the opportunity to grow, to learn, and to be seen as the human being he is, not as a number or a statistic, not as a stereotype." She paused, and her gaze fell back on the boy, who still stood quietly waiting to hear what came next. "And you, young man," she continued with a soft smile, "you are not alone in this fight." She spoke to him as if he were a person, as if his existence mattered more than just the outcome of this case. The boy's chest tightened with emotion. His throat felt thick as he tried to hold back the tears that threatened to spill over his eyelids. He had spent so long pretending to be tough, pretending that nothing could hurt him, but hearing the judge speak with such compassion broke through that armor like a wave crashing against a shore. He wanted to ask her so many questions. He wanted to know if this moment would change the course of his life, but instead he simply nodded his head. He couldn't find the words to speak, but the lump in his throat was all the answer she needed. The judge's voice broke the silence. Once more her words were direct but still filled with care. She addressed the court again, stating that this case would not proceed in the typical manner, that every step forward would be carefully considered, and that the boy's well-being would come first, that the legal system would not be allowed to treat him like a statistic any longer, that his needs, his story, and his humanity would guide the decisions made from this moment on. The judge reached out slowly and took the crumpled note from the boy's trembling hands. The room remained silent as she unfolded it carefully. The boy stood motionless, his eyes not daring to look up. The judge's eyes scanned the words on the paper, her gaze softening as she read the note. It was brief, but packed with raw emotion. The boy had written how he felt lost and invisible, how the world around him seemed to misunderstand him. Every time he tried to speak, no one heard him. He spoke of his fear of being judged without a chance to explain himself, and his desire to be treated like any other child. He had written about the confusion he felt in this place, this cold courtroom where words and actions seemed to carry so much weight, but felt so far removed from the simple truth of his existence. His hands began to shake as the judge continued to read. The boy had put his heart on that paper, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt like he was finally saying what needed to be said. It wasn't just an apology or an excuse, it was his story, his truth, a truth he could no longer keep locked away. The judge finished reading and placed the note down on the desk. She took a deep breath and looked up at the boy. The room remained still with a tension that seemed to wrap around everyone present. It was as if time had stopped for just a moment. No one knew what would happen next, but they were all waiting for the judge's reaction. The boy still stood frozen in place, his eyes on the floor, afraid to meet the judge's gaze, afraid of what she might say. The judge studied him for a moment before speaking. Her voice was calm, but filled with an unexpected warmth. She said nothing about the note itself, nothing about the words or the emotion behind them. Instead, she simply said, "You've shown a lot of courage today. You've spoken in a way that many adults could not, and in doing so, you've reminded us all of the power of a voice when it is used to speak the truth." The boy looked up at her slowly. The words were unexpected. He had been prepared for something else, something harsher, a punishment or a reprimand, but not this. She continued, "You are not invisible. You are not a mistake. You matter more than you know, and I want you to understand that this courtroom is here to listen to you, not to silence you." She looked directly at the boy, her gaze soft but firm. "You may have come here today feeling like your voice didn't count, but let me tell you something. You've shown us all that it does." The boy's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure if he had heard her right. Could it be that she was actually listening to him, truly listening? His mind raced with questions and confusion, but for the first time since the trial began, he felt something shift. Something inside him stirred a hope he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. He had spent so long trying to disappear, trying to be quiet, so that no one would see the hurt inside him. But this judge, this stranger, had seen him, she had heard him, and in that moment, something changed. He wasn't just a boy accused of something he didn't understand. He was a person with a story to tell, and someone had finally taken the time to listen. The courtroom was tense and heavy with anticipation, the air thick with uncertainty as the young boy sat quietly at the defendant's table, his small hands clenched tightly in his lap, his head hung low as if trying to make himself invisible. He was only 10 years old, but the weight of the situation seemed far too much for his fragile shoulders. Beside him, his mother sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes filled with worry. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her son, each one judging him for something he didn't understand. The judge, a middle-aged woman with sharp features and years of experience, sat at the bench, her face set in a stern expression. She had seen countless cases like this over the years, but there was something different about this one. She couldn't put her finger on it, but she could feel it deep inside. The boy's presence felt different. The way he held himself spoke volumes, even without words. It was as if he was silently pleading for help, but had no idea how to ask for it. The case was a simple one on the surface. A misunderstanding at school had led to the boy being accused of something he didn't fully comprehend yet. There was a fear in his eyes, a fear that the system he found himself in would not listen to him, that he would be judged before he even had a chance to speak. The boy glanced up at the judge for a split second and immediately looked down again. He was too afraid to look her in the eyes. The judge noticed this. His fear was palpable, and for a moment she found herself wondering what had brought this child to this point. His heart seemed to be beating wildly in his chest, and the judge could see the stress in his face. She could tell that he felt out of place in this room, in this cold, sterile environment where everything seemed so formal and impersonal. It wasn't like the classroom he was used to, where a teacher might offer him a smile or a word of encouragement. Here in this courtroom, there was no comfort, nothing familiar, and certainly no reassurance that things would be okay. The boy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes darted from the judge to the lawyer to his mother. He felt small and insignificant in this sea of adults who seemed to have control over everything around him. The judge watched him closely. She could see the quiet struggle inside him. The boy was trying to figure out how to navigate this world that had already made decisions about him before he had a chance to explain himself. The tension in the room grew heavier and heavier until finally the boy stood up slowly, his legs shaking as if uncertain of what to do next. With trembling hands he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. His fingers were slick with sweat, and the paper was crumpled as he held it up toward the judge. His heart raced as he stood there motionless, waiting for the judge to respond. The room fell completely silent as everyone turned their gaze toward him. He could feel the eyes on him, the pressure building. He wasn't sure why he had written the note or what he'd expected to happen, but it was all he could do at that moment. The boy held the note out toward the judge, his fingers stiff with nervousness, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Would she read it? Would she even care? Would it change anything? Or would it just be another attempt that went unnoticed? He couldn't say a word, but his note spoke for him.